I believe that President Javier Milei is trying to subtly warn Donald Trump and other conservative leaders of the mistakes that they're making. He is doing this indirectly, for instance, like the speech he gave for the Titan Award at Trump's inauguration. I think one of his most important warnings is against gradualism. He and his team examined all the reformist presidents of Argentina and found all the reformists with gradualist approach failed, while those with shock therapy had initial success.
Because the battle is long and we need the right intellectual tools to win it. First of all, our battle is against the ideas of gradualism. The Argentines are used to disappointment. It is the product of having lived in a country infected by socialism for 100 years. There have been dictatorships and democratic governments, but the only constant has been collectivism in some of its forms. There have also been, it is true, reformist experiences, but until now all of them have failed. None had been able to make the transition from the impoverished collectivism to the redemptive capitalism of the poor. This cycle of illusions and failure for decades has caused many Argentines to choose to emigrate if they had the possibility, or to be content with surviving if they did not have it. This has been repeated practically throughout the 20th century, with the consequence of the destruction of wealth and capital that it implied, characterizing what we have called the century of Argentine humiliation. Coalitions of governments that had been chosen to implement reforms in Argentina quickly failed and the vicious circle began again. The question that many made over decades was why have reformist coalitions failed in Argentine history? The reason is simple. Until now, no government, with the exception of the government of Dr. Carlos Menem, if one once had dared to apply the recipe of liberalism without fear. This happens because of fear of losing support, fear of breaking agreements, fear of social protest, or of losing the next elections. This is because politicians, regardless of their party, have as their first mandate to remain in power at any cost. They only then think about making the changes they have promised. In the same way that a businessman seeks a maximization of the utilities of his company, a politician as a main driver in the face of anything else, maximizing the amount of time that is in power and the size of the budget that he manages. It is because of this fear of losing support that they accommodate their ideas to keep them, such that it gives them tranquility. Wrongly, that this way they will stay in power longer. As such, under whatever excuse, even those who want to make changes or reforms opt for reforms that stop gradualism, which inexorably end up failing. This paradox is interesting. We could call it the paradox of the reformist politician. Convinced that the most important thing for a country to change is its permanence in power, it produces its own failure. Well, we are reformists, but we are not politicians. We do not operate under the premise that what is most important is our permanence and power. But for us, the most important thing is to implement our reforms. We govern without fear, applying sharp measures to generate confidence in society and in the market. Not only because those are our convictions, but because empirical evidence also accompanies us. For 1952 onwards, all these shock programs, including the one in 1959, were expansive in activity and employment, and all gradualist programs ended badly.
Gradualism is almost the definition of being a conservative. Milei is basically asking conservatives to go against their very nature. A historical point that proves Milei is that they got Reagan to extend his tax cuts over 3 years instead of doing it all at once, which just extended the recession and allowed the Democrats to gain larger majorities in the House and Senate. Notice the Democrats didn't give a damn that this hurt their core constituency. Milei makes a similar point, using what in the U.S. would be considered a football analogy. The best defense is a good offense.
Seventh, the best offense is always a good offense. There is nothing worse than living in a place where there is no war. The liberal right has fallen many times in that trap, wasting time giving explanations to those who do not deserve it. We do not have to explain anything to those who have ruined the country. We must be the ones who dictate the rhythm of the country. We must be the ones who dictate the rhythm of events, ensuring that the game is played according to our rules. And if we have to receive a blow, we must respond with three.
I feel Milei's next rule comes straight from Ayn Rand, which may say more about me than about Milei. Rand said, "In any compromise between good and evil, only evil can profit."
Second, we do not compromise with the enemy. The other fallacy that reformist politicians tend to apply is the fallacy of consensus. Most of the reformist experience is clash against the political class, who tell them that they must compromise their reforms with them. However, if the politicians that one faces represent an ideology set against them, then they do not have the right to do so. There may never be an agreement between good and evil because we work for opposite interests. You cannot negotiate the terms of a reform with those who live by preserving one's privileges. Between good and evil because we work for opposing interests. It is not possible to negotiate the terms of a reform with those who live to preserve their privileges.
Milei made a similar point in another speech, in which he seemed to be channeling Benjamin Franklin. Compromising your values to get votes will leave you with neither.
Third, we must never negotiate ideas in order to get a vote. Denying your convictions to get votes will leave you without conviction and without votes. And in terms of security, we hold that the one who does it pays for it. In short, we defend life, freedom, and private property. It is also worth mentioning that regardless of who they are and where they come from, it is welcome anyone who wants to accompany us in defense of these pillars. We, on the other hand, are not willing to negotiate ideas, but all those who want to embrace the ideas of freedom will always be welcome.
In this next rule, Milei talks about dealing with urgent versus dealing with important issues. This reminds me of when Bush Jr. said he had to compromise free market principles to save the economy. All he really did was enrich a bunch of his criminal banker buddies by stealing from hardworking Americans and destroying their dreams. Milei even mentions this.
On the other hand, thirdly, it is necessary to deal simultaneously with both the urgent and the important. We assume in an absolutely critical context, knowing that the urgent was to stabilize the economy, that the important thing was to disarm the collectivist leviathan that have been mounted in Argentina during the last 100 years. That is why our second measure in economic matter had to do not with the urgent, but with the important. The Decree 7023 was the beginning of a set of structural reforms that will undoubtedly open our markets and will bring us closer to the rest of the world, and it is already doing that. In the short time of this decree, we sent the bill based on the Congress, which together represents a reform of the state 8 times larger than the one carried out by the government of Carlos Saúl. That is, we made the largest structural reform in all of Argentina's history, rewinding 123 years of decadence. That is, we not only worry about the urgent, which was to stabilize the economy, but we also embody the most ambitious reform project in the history of our country. We did it all at the same time because the urgent is not justifiable to postpone the important.
In this clip, Milei warns about the goal of efficiency in government. His point metaphorically is the chainsaw, not the scalpel. It seems like he's talking directly to Donald Trump.
Fourth point, and above all very important on a global level, to weaken the state. The idea that I want to leave you with is that reforming the state implies returning power that was taken away from the citizenry. And the only way to do it is by shrinking the state. There is no other. I say this in response to those who advocate for a great but efficient state. I know it may sound nice or well-intentioned, but believe me, when a politician tells them he wants an efficient state, he is advocating for better mechanisms to steal the wealth from the citizens. The only acceptable state is the smallest possible. To return to the taxpayer what is his and end the sale of favors. There is no better method than to eliminate state bureaucracy, so that the possibility of selling those favors does not exist. The life of the people cannot be subject to the criteria of a bureaucrat behind the counter. Deregulation is the only successful path. It is the path of the chainsaw. It is the path of the land. Because a state that develops tasks that do not compete with it ends up not fulfilling its basic responsibilities. As Murray Neaton Rothbard said, the inventor of anarcho-capitalism, the bigger the state, the less resources will be used to satisfy the desires of consumers who have contributed to the production, and more resources will be used to satisfy the desires of consumers who do not produce, that is, the parasites, the friends of politicians.
¡Afuera!
Milei in his first year in office reduced the number of ministries in half. What would it look like if Donald Trump did the same thing? The U.S. has 15 cabinet-level positions. I think all the ones in red should be eliminated and are inconsistent with a proper government.